Hey team, we're going to learn how we can add live chat to a Next.js app with Stream and use it to sync replay of that live chat to a video. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. This video is brought to you and sponsored by Stream. Stream is a chat and feed service that allows you to easily add activity feeds and chat messaging to your app. It has easy to use APIs and SDKs that makes it a breeze to use in whatever stack you're working with. Head over to spacejelly.dev/stream to create your Maker account today, where you'll get free access to Stream's APIs and SDKs, like the React Chat SDK, which we'll be working with today. So digging in, we're going to learn how we can use the Chat API and SDK from Stream in order to add live chat to our Next.js app, with the goal being to build a somewhat similar experience to what you would have with Twitch, where we're not going to get that in depth, but the goal here is to have a live chat where somebody can type something along with a video, then we can replay it, and that chat's going to follow along with the same timing of the video. So to simplify getting started, I created this demo starter that we're going to use, which is a Next.js application, which just gives us a starting point with the video embedded on the page and a few buttons just to get that part moving forward. If you want to follow along, this link will be inside of the YouTube description, so make sure you find it there. But we're going to head down into the README, where we're going to grab this command where you can use either yarn or npx, whatever you prefer, but we're going to use create next app. I'm going to paste it in my terminal along with my stream chat, where what's going to happen is in the background, Next.js is going to clone down that project from GitHub. It's going to install all the dependencies for me, and it's even going to reset Git history so that I have a great starting point for moving forward. Once it's done, I'm going to cd into that new directory and open it up inside of my code editor. We're inside, we're going to be able to find our code, including pages.index.js, which includes all the boilerplate that I added, including be able to embed a YouTube video, where I just embedded a simple YouTube video for now. We want to be able to store a user where somebody's going to be able to log in, quote unquote log in, by using their user ID, and we're going to be able to control that video player with the refs of that video player itself. So as we scroll down, we can see that we're not doing a whole lot yet. We're just allowing somebody to type in their username, and we're going to have access to that player. Now, if I run yarn dev inside of my terminal, it's going to run a local development server where I can open that up inside of my browser, where we can see once it loads, I have this input where I can type in my username, but once I join, we can see that it loads this video. I can start it with my buttons where we can see the video starting to play. I can stop that video, and I can even replay it, where this is all going to come into play when we start to sync that up with our live chat. So at this point, we want to actually integrate Stream into our application so we can add that live chat, and we can also later then sync up those messages so that they can replay with the video. Now there's going to be two parts of this. One is going to be the client itself, where that's going to be how we authenticate with Stream and how we can communicate. But then we're going to have the UI components, where that's going to be able to be how we easily add and drop in the live chat experience into our application. So we're going to first head to the client docs, where we can see that we get a nice introduction, but what we're going to look for right away is we're going to yarn or npm install our stream chat. So in my terminal, I'm going to copy and paste that command in of yarn add stream chat, where now we have our dependency. Now, once it's installed, we can actually start to import that stream chat instance into our application. So we're going to copy this import. I'm going to go to the top of the file of pages.index.js, and I'm going to paste in that import where we're destructuring the stream chat from the stream chat dependency. Now, if we scroll down a little bit past the getting started, we're going to see that the first section that we have is clients and users. Now, when using Stream, what we need to do is we need to get an instance of Stream that we're going to work with, and that's going to be our client. And from there, we're going to connect a user, because anytime we use Stream, we want to make sure that we authenticate and connect a user to that actual live chat instance. Now you can actually see here that my API key is embedded because I'm logged into Stream, but we're going to see how we can create an app or a chat app so that we can use that API key to get this instance. But first, let's copy this client command. And inside of our application, we don't want to simply paste in our client right as a new line, because what that's going to do is it's going to be considered as part of the render cycle, and that's going to give us a little bit of unexpected results for how we're actually managing that client. So instead, and what's considered best practices from a Stream point of view, is we're going to store this client inside of state. And to do that, we're going to use effect, so that once that effect runs, we're going to get that instance of Stream, and then we're going to store it inside of the state, so that later we have that client to connect to the user and whatever else we want to use. So to start at the top, I'm going to import use effect into my dependencies from React. Then under my video ref, so that we can keep the organization a little bit sane here, I'm going to add my use effect, and inside is where I'm going to get that stream instance. And we're going to replace this API key in a second, but then once we have that client, we want to use the state to set that client. So I'm going to clone this user and set user, where I'm going to call that client and set client, where let's just leave that undefined to start. But once we have that client, let's set it into state by running set client and passing in that client. Now we want to also make sure we add a dependency array here so that it's not just firing on every single render. And for now, let's just leave that as an empty array so that it only fires once on the first time. But once we have that set up, let's use our console log and look at what is actually happening once that state is updated. Now, before we can actually see that run though, as I mentioned, we need to get that API key. Now we're going to do two things here. First, we're going to create a new application inside of Stream, but instead of pasting that API key right inside of the page here, we're going to use an environment variable to add it in there, as we don't want that exposed inside of our code. And it's just best practice so that we can use it throughout the application wherever we want and only define it once. So once you're signed up and logged into your Stream account, we can see that if we're over in the apps section inside of our dashboard, we can see that we have this section where we can just simply create an app. So I'm going to click create an app, and you can use whatever you want for the name here. I'm going to call it Space Jelly, but then we need to set a few settings, including our server location, where because I'm in the US, I'm going to select Ohio. Chat data storage location, I'm on the East Coast, so I'm going to select East, but do whatever makes sense for you or your users. And then we have clone existing app. I'm not going to clone an existing app, I don't have one, but generally speaking, if you wanted to take this app and create it from an existing one, this is where you can use it to create the clone existing app. But now I'm going to click create app. And if I start to scroll down, we can see that it would give me a lot of information regarding metrics if I wanted to start to dive in. But what I'm particularly interested in right now is the app access keys, where we can see we have both a key and a secret, where for now, I just need the key. So I'm going to copy that key value. And back inside my application, I'm going to create a new file in the root of the project called .env.local, where inside I'm going to call it next public stream API key, and I'm going to paste that in as the value. Now, if you notice here, I called it next_public_stream API key, and that's important because we're using it in the client. So we want to tell Next.js by adding the next public that we want to be able to allow it to be used inside the client. But now I'm going to copy that key and head it back over to my index.js, where I'm going to replace that value with that environment variable. But once we head back into our application, after it reloads, we can open up the terminal or the web console, and we can see that we're getting that client instance whenever we're logging that out. And we can even see our API key associated right there. But now we can start to use that to connect to a user and do whatever we want for setting up this chat. Now back inside the documentation, we can see that the very next thing that we're going to do is we're going to connect our user. Now, one thing to note here is because I reloaded the page after I created a new app, which we're working with here, we can see that it has my new API key. But we're just going to copy this value for now just as is so we can see what this is going to look like when trying to connect. So I'm going to paste this in at the bottom of my use effect hook, where we can see if you have a good eye, we're actually using an await here. So this isn't going to work at the top level of a use effect, as it's not an asynchronous function and it can't be an asynchronous function. So what we need to actually do is we need to wrap this with an async function and immediately invoke it so that we can take advantage of the async await syntax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with my parentheses and I'm going to say async function of run, and I'm going to immediately invoke that by passing those additional parentheses, but I'm going to copy and paste all of my code into that function so that we can use it with the async await syntax. Now, starting to look at this connect user statement, we can see that we're passing in the user's information, including the ID, name, and even an image for their avatar. But then as a second argument, we're passing in this token, and this token isn't something that we can fake. So we need to pass in a real token for that user ID. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to create a serverless function, as we can't simply do that from the client with our public API key. We need to use our secret. So we're going to use that serverless function and wrap it so we can create a secure proxy, where what we're going to do is we're going to send that API endpoint, the user that we want to connect. It's going to return to us a token, and then we're going to use that token to connect the user to our client. So if we look inside of our page directory, we can see that we have pages/API where there's an existing hello function where all it's doing is it's returning this object of John Doe. But we can use this as an example of how we can get started with our own serverless function. Now, if this is your first time working with a Next.js API function, we can see that if we go to /API/hello, we're going to see that object response. The nice thing is Next.js makes this file-based routing easily accessible so we can create new serverless functions on the fly. But we want to create a new serverless function to use, so I'm going to actually just duplicate our existing one. So let's call it token.js as we want to generate a token. But ultimately what we want to do here is inside, we want to accept our user ID that we want to authenticate. We're going to then create a token for that user, and then we're going to pass it back to the application. So first off, the request object here is going to have a body property associated with it, but it's going to be a text string. So what we want to say is we want to grab constant data is equal to json.parse our request.body. Now, particularly what we're going to pass in is the ID, so we can just destructure that right away. So we can say we're going to grab that destructured ID from the parsed request body. Now, once we have that ID, we want to start to use the Stream SDK in order to create a new instance of the Stream SDK and then generate that token. Now back into the Stream docs, we'll probably come back to this later, but what we want to do is head over to clients and users, and we're going to navigate to tokens on authentication, where if we start to scroll down, we're going to see exactly what we want, where we can see this example that's currently in Python for generating a new token, but I'm going to switch that to Node.js since we're going to create a serverless function in Node.js. But we can see here what's happening is we're having 3 values that we're going to use for this SDK, where we need the API key, which we have, we need the API secret, which we can grab from our console, and then we have the user ID, which we're going to be passing in as that parameter that we just saw. But what we can do is we can copy this code since we already have the import and dependency for this, and I'm going to head to my function. I'm going to paste it right after I'm grabbing that ID so I can pass all these values to my actual Stream instance, where we can see with the API key, we can first replace that with the same one that we're using inside the client. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that API key and replace it. We can even see that we can replace this user ID with the ID that we're grabbing, but now we need to also get that API secret. So back inside of the Stream app, we can see that I have my app access keys like we saw before where I have my key, but we have the secret, which is what we need. Now I'm going to click to reveal this. I'm going to later delete it, so don't even try to recreate it inside of your own app, but we can see what the key is going to look like. But I can just simply click this copy button. I'm going to head back to my .env local file, and let's call this new one Stream API secret, and we're going to set that equal to the value. Now, just to make sure that you're aware, we do not want to add next public to this because we do not want the secret available in the client. We only want to use it, and we only want to allow it to be exposed inside of the client, meaning in the browser. We do not want the API secret to be used outside of server code. So now that we have that though, we can come back and we can use it just like we did the other environment variable. And now we're ready to start running this. Now, as one last thing, we need to return that token. So I'm going to pass it inside of that JSON response where then we can finally grab it inside of the client. Now back inside of our React app, we can see here that we are still trying to connect that user, but we want to make sure we get that token for that particular user ID before we try to connect. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to run an await fetch function. We're going to make that request to /API/token, where we're going to pass in a second argument where we're going to say we want to use a method of post, where we also want to pass a body, which we're going to use JSON.stringify, and we're going to pass in our ID, which is going to be our user ID. Now, if we remember before, the bootstrapped code has this user object where we're setting the user based off of that input in the UI, and that's stored under the ID property. So I'm going to say for that, I want to specify my ID as user.id. Now, since we make this fetch request, we want to transform that fetch data to JSON to make it usable. So I'm going to add a then statement at the end where I'm going to say R for response. I'm going to use R.json to transform it to JSON, which is going to return it in this statement. But then we want to grab this value. So I'm going to say constant and destructure token, since I know that data is going to have token at the top level, where we now have that token that we can start to use inside of this connect user statement. So I'm going to pass in this token instead of this string, and I'm going to also replace this ID and name with my user.id to make sure they're the same value. And of course we could add a separate input for the name and the image, but we're going to just leave those as is just for this demo. Now, before we try to run this code, we have one more thing. Now, because we are using that user ID, it's now a dependency for our use effect statement. And we're not going to start off with that user ID until we quote log in. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we establish this as a dependency. I'm going to add it into the brackets here so that anytime this user ID changes, our use effect hook will run. But inside of the very top of our use effect, we're also going to say if we don't have a user.id, we're just going to return and not try to do anything. But we want to make sure that that user object actually exists. So I'm going to add a optional chaining on this so that it's going to first say, does user exist? And if it does, I'm going to grab that ID. But once we have that, we should be ready to run. But then I'm going to also store this connected user to a temporary value of connected user, just so we can see what this looks like. And I'm going to console log this out right away, just so we can see what that looks like. Now, once we hit the browser, we can see that I'm getting a 500 if I try to log in, and it's because I actually forgot something. And if we look at the terminal, we can scroll up and see that I forgot to import the stream chat inside of a serverless function. So we can see here our stream chat get instance. We can grab the same exact import that we had inside of our index.js and paste that right at the top. And this time, once we actually try to log in with our user, we can see that it's going to connect, and we see that connected user along with all the information about it, which isn't much since we're not passing in much, but we can see that it's successfully connecting. So now that we have our user connected, let's start to actually do the work for our channel. Now back inside of the introduction for React, and we're going to scroll down now past the user and the client since we're past that, and we can see a few instances for how we can connect to the channel. What we're going to do specifically is we're going to copy this first one where we have client.channel, where we pass in a few arguments for our specific channel. So I'm going to paste this in right after we connect to our user, and I'm going to change a few things here where I'm going to pass in an ID of space jelly, and then let's call this a name of space jelly as well. Now, if we go back to the docs and scroll down a little further, we can see that one of the types that we're passing in is messaging, where we have a few different ways that we can create a new channel for how we're going to interact. And because we're doing this as a live interaction with a video, let's select the live stream channel. So instead of messaging, I'm going to update that to live stream. So at this point, we'll have our channel stored in this channel constant, and we're going to be able to test this in a second, but we want to be able to use this channel throughout our application. So similar to what we did with the client, we're going to store this in our state as well. So to start, I'm going to duplicate this client line. I'm going to call this channel, where we're also going to set the channel. We're then at the bottom where I create that channel, let's set channel to channel, and then let's console log that out as well, so that we can test that out. Now, once we log back in with our ASDF user, we can see that we get our client, and we also get our new channel, which is a live stream of Space Jelly. Now, at this point, we're good enough where we can start to dig into the UI, but as best practices, I want to cover one point where anytime that we actually have a hook where we're using the use effect, we want to make sure that we clean up our resources afterwards. So the way that we can actually clean up those resources is by using the return statement inside of a use effect, where we're going to return a function where inside we're going to say client.disconnect user to make sure that resource is then made available. But then we're going to also say, let's set the channel to undefined, as we no longer need that instance of the channel. But now at this point, we're set up with all of our legwork where we have our client, our channel, and our user all established. And now we can get to the fun part where we start to display the UI. So before we dove into that, we talked about how we have our client and our UI component. So we're going to head back to our chat SDK for React, and we're this time going to go to UI components docs. Now, first things first, we want to install this new SDK so that we can use the components. So if we scroll down, and make sure you read everything first if you're interested in learning more about the tooling, but we can see that we have either NPM or we have Yarn, where we're going to install this stream chat React where we already have the stream chat. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to run yarn add stream chat React, and it's going to add my dependency, and I'll run yarn dev to spin up my development server. But now let's actually grab some of the React code so that we can use it in our app. Now let's head over to the getting started section, and we can see that we have a nice example here, and we have all the documentation for all the components we need, including some custom code examples. But I like this specific React chat tutorial, so I'm going to click that link at the top, where I'll include this link in the description as well. But we can see that if we start to scroll down, we have some nice walkthroughs for how we can get started with all this, where particularly I want this create a live stream style chat app, where we can see a great example of how we can get started, including all of our component imports. We're going to import CSS to make sure that our client gets all of the styles that it needs. And we can see we're doing a lot of the things that we're already doing, including connecting to that user. But then finally, we're going to use those components. So first things first, let's actually import all those components. So we're going to copy this import line, and up underneath my stream chat, I'm going to paste in all of those component imports. I'm also going to copy in the CSS import to make sure the styles get added. And then we're going to paste it above our existing styles to make sure that those can override the other styles, but then we have what we need in order to start using the components. So I'm going to also copy in this chat component along with everything that's nested. If I scroll down to the bottom of my application, we can see where we have this chat where I'm going to paste right inside that div all of those different components. And the only thing that we want to keep in mind here is we're passing in this chat client and the channel, and we don't have those things available to us right away. As we remember, we need to log into the application and then we start to initialize a lot of those things. So we need to make sure we have those before we try to use those. Now, first thing, we're naming ours client, not chat client. So let's update that, but let's also wrap this with a client and channel, and then we're going to use our components. So I'm going to paste that right inside. And what we're doing here is we're saying that we want to make sure client is truly, channel is truly, other, like AKA they actually exist. And if both of those are true, we're going to try to use our components. But now back inside of our application, let's log in. And we can see as soon as we log in, we now have this live channel. And if I actually start to type, hey, I am Colby, we can see that it's pasting in this avatar that was as part of the actual demo application. But we can see that I have my messages starting to pop up. And if I refresh and I try to log back in, we can see that those messages are going to persist as we have those now inside of that channel instance. Now at this point, we have a lot of our application. We have our video, which came with the starter, but now we have our entire live chat experience where anytime somebody pops in here, they can live chat with each other about whatever they want. But what we specifically want to do is sync this with our video so that anytime we start to play our video and somebody starts to talk about it, like, hey, his shirt is cool, we want to make sure that it pops up at that same time of the video. So to start, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sync all these messages to local state so that we can capture the timestamp of the video for when they were actually made. Now, the way that we're going to do that is on our channel, we're going to be able to set up an event handler so that anytime a new message comes in, we can fire a function. And we're going to set that into state. Particularly, we're going to create a messages state. So we're going to say anytime a new message comes, we're going to set messages and update it to include both the message and the timestamp of the video of where it occurred. Now, in order to do this, we need to go back to the top of our docs where we're not going to work with the UI components, we're going to work with the client. So we're going to go back to the client documentation, and we're going to go to the events section where we want to listen for events. And we can see here that we can specify channel.on, and we can do a lot of different things. And particularly what we want to do is we want to listen to new messages. So we're going to specify that anytime message.new, similar to the syntax of message.deleted, we're going to say anytime on message.new, we're going to trigger an event. Now to do this, we're going to use a new use effect where we can set our dependency on this channel. So I'm going to scroll down to under this exact use effect, and I'm going to say use effect. I'm going to create a new function inside there where my dependency is going to be that channel, but we're going to say inside here, if channel doesn't exist, we're going to return. But if it does exist, I want to say that channel.on, and I'm going to say message.new. I want to create a new function that's going to fire some functionality. But before we actually test this and move on, we want to make sure we're cleaning up our resources similar to what we did with disconnect user, but we want to make sure we do that for our channel event handler. So I'm going to call constant listener. I'm going to set that equal to our channel on because it's going to return that instance. Then I'm going to return a new function, and I'm going to say listener.unsubscribe, if I can actually spell that correctly. But let's see what this looks like. Whenever that function is called, we get an argument of event. So let's console log out that event to see what we have inside. So I'm going to keep my terminal open, but once we log in and start to go in here, and I actually try to type a new message, just simply, hey, we can see we have that new event and we have all the information about it, including the type, and we can see that we have our message along with all the details about that message, including the simple message of, hey. So ultimately, we want to take this message and we want to push it onto that messages state that we created. So I'm going to say set messages, and I'm going to use previous, and I'm going to pass in a function to update this so that we can take our previous value and append it to that. So I'm going to return a new array, which our previous should be an array, where we're going to spread out the previous value to make sure all those previous messages are stored, but then we're going to pass in a new object with our new message. Now inside that, we want to store two things: the original message that just got passed in as the event. So we're going to say message is equal to event.message, but then we also want to pass the time, and that time is going to be whatever we get from the player. Now, before we get that timestamp, we do need to keep in mind that because we are using set messages and we're trying to spread out this previous value needs to be an array. So if we scroll up to the top under the set messages and the messages, we can set this as an array as the default value. That way, anytime the app initializes, it's going to default to that empty array. Now, how do we get that timestamp? If we scroll down a little bit, we see a few instances for how we can actually get the player ref so that we can access the player inside of the browser, which is going to be that YouTube player. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy this line of getting the constant of players equal to the get internal player. I'm going to paste this in above my set messages. And so we can see what this looks like. Let's console log out our player. And once we send a message this time, we can see all the usual stuff, but we now see that player and we see a bunch of different things that we can grab. But what we particularly want to get is that timestamp. And if we start to look inside, we can find out where we can actually get that. And we can see this get current time, which is what we want to use to get the current time of the video being played. So I'm going to create a new constant called time, and I'm going to set that equal to player.getCurrentTime. And this get current time is actually going to be an asynchronous function. So what we want to do is we want to first await that player.getCurrentTime, but that means we also need to make this actual function itself an async function. So we can simply add async to the beginning of our created function for this listener, and then we can get that time anytime it occurs. So let's get rid of this 0 and we can pass in that time as is. Let's get rid of this console log. But now that we're running this, let's console log out our messages so we can see that pop up anytime we do get a new message. So I'm going to get rid of these original console logs and I'm going to simply log out messages to see what happens. So now inside of my application, we can already see our default empty array, but if I log in as Kobayashi and I start to type my messages, let's say, hey again, we can see that I get that message and we can see that the current time is 0. But now let's start to play the video. We can see, let's give it a second, 1, 2, 3, testing again. And if we look at the messages again, let's stop this. We can see that we have two messages this time. We have one at 0, which was that original message, but we have that new one at 3.5 seconds. So at this point, we have our chat, we have our player, and they're kind of communicating with each other. We're able to say, hey, whenever this message is sent, what time of that video was it sent? So now what we need to do is anytime we replay this video, we want to go through that message list and find the appropriate message and then replay it into our chat instance. And to do that, we need to do two things. First of all, this chat is going to live as is. So we're going to create a new temporary chat, and then we're going to be able to replay the new messages onto that chat. But then we're going to create a timer for the replay of this video so that we can keep getting the current time, and then we can evaluate which messages make sense for that particular time. So to start, whenever replay occurs, we want to create a new channel. And to do that, we're going to use that set channel. But if we scroll down to where we were creating that channel before, let's just copy and paste that exact same thing and use that as our starting point. Where if we go to our replay function, which is on replay video right here, I'm going to paste that inside and we're going to recreate a new channel. But again, this needs to be a unique channel if we're just going to replay the videos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use backticks here, and I'm going to pass in a unique value, specifically just date.now, nothing too fancy. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a new unique channel for me to replay it. Now, just as a quick note, the way that I'm doing this with Date Now is going to create a bunch of new chat instance or channel instances that are just going to live on. And if you're doing this in a production application, you probably want to be more organized with this approach. This is just how we can actually establish this and walk through the tutorial and see how this is working. But if you're doing it in production, make sure you do something with cleaning up the resources so that you don't just have an unlimited amount of channels sitting there that don't actively get used. But now with this code, what's going to happen is we're going to create that new channel, and then we're going to set the channel. So it's instantly going to set the new channel in the updated state and update our components. So we can see exactly that happen by simply clicking start, which is going to play the video, but then we're going to click replay, where we can see that it started the video again, but we have a completely new instance of chat where nothing is being played. Now, if I refresh the page and log in again, every single time we log in, we're going to get that original chat, but we can see that it gets refreshed when we try to replay, which is where we're going to replay all of our actual messages. So the way that I'm going to sync these messages is I'm going to create an interval that's going to run every second so that any time that we look at the current time of the video during that interval and the actual messages that exist, we can replay them as we go. So to start, I'm going to run set interval and I'm going to pass in a new function. And then as my second argument, I'm going to pass in 1000, which is 1000 milliseconds. So this runs every second. So the first thing I want to do inside of this is get the time of the video at its current point being played. So we already have the player here. So I'm going to say constant time is equal to await player.get current time. And as we probably noticed, we're using this await. So we're going to need to make this an async function. So I'm going to tag this interval with async so that I can use it to get the time. But now that we have the time, I want to look through all the messages and find out whatever the current messages are for this interval so that I can post them into the channel. So I'm going to create a new constant called current messages, and I'm going to set that equal to messages.filter, where I can pass in a function to determine if it's the message that qualifies for the time. So I'm going to pass in that new function, and as my argument, I'm going to destructure that value and simply get the time. But because we already used the time, let's call this message time. But the way that I'm going to determine this is I'm going to create the difference between this message time and the time itself so that we can figure out if it's within that range. So inside of this filter function, I'm going to say constant diff is equal to time minus message time. So with this diff, I want to make sure that this difference is within the value that I want for the time. And I'm going to use 1 second for that factor. So I want to make sure that difference is within 1 second of the video time itself. So I'm going to return this statement where I'm going to say, I want to make sure the diff is less than or equal to our 1 second. But I also want to make sure that we don't have a negative value here. So I also want to say, and that our diff is greater than 0. Otherwise, if we have a negative value, it's going to just keep grabbing the old messages and keep posting it. But now at this point, we should have all the messages that correspond with that time. So what we can do now is loop through all those messages, and every single time we find a message that exists, we're going to send it to that channel. So we're going to say under current messages dot for each message. And because we know that inside each message, it's both the time and another message property, I'm going to actually destructure that and grab just the message. But now inside of here, we want to actually post that message to the channel. So back to the docs. If we go over to the messages section inside of the React client docs, we can see that if we go to messages overview, we have the example right at the top where we can use the channel to send a message. And we're going to do exactly that. So I'm going to copy that code snippet. I'm going to paste it in, and of course we don't need that message constant. We're going to also make this an async function since we can use the await here and make sure that our formatting here is okay. But then instead of this text property being set manually, we're going to say that we want to pass in the message.text. So now let's give this a try. I'm going to log in just like I did before. I didn't spell it right, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and start the video. And I'm going to say again, hey, his shirt is pretty cool. Let's add another message after a second here. Let's say, oh, nice, that looks awesome. And now let's try to replay that, where we can see that once we start to replay it, let's get rid of the console log just so that we have a little bit easier way to see this. We can already see our message of, hey, his shirt is pretty cool. And if we wait a few seconds here, we see, oh, nice, that looks awesome, which is exactly when we posted it inside of the video when we were originally trying to play it. Now at this point, if I refresh the page and try to log in and click replay again, I don't have any messages at this point because I didn't send them in that particular instance and we're only storing them to local state. But this can easily be extended if you want to save those messages and the time that they were actually added to the video to a database so that you can query that and replay it every time anybody wants to replay it anywhere, like you would see on Twitch. Now this pretty much gives us everything we need in order to capture live comments during a video stream, whether it's YouTube or whatever we want. But as one last little thing, when we have our chat instance where we want to be able to capture anything we want during that video replay, we want to have this message input. But what about when we replay? We probably don't want to have that message input, which is going to conflict with any of those messages that are getting played back. But the cool thing is we can customize that stream UI on the fly however we want. In particular, if we look inside of our components, we have this message input, which is where that input is initialized. So we just need to simply not include it if we don't want to. And the way we can do that is we can wrap it similarly to how we have client and channel, where we can say that if something is true, we can simply not show it. Now to do that, we can grab the channel ID, but currently we don't have a real easy searchable way for how we determine if it is a replay. Now we could store that in state, which is certainly a good way to do that, but how about for now, we can just add the word replay into this new channel ID anytime that we create that new channel. And if we go back down to where we were starting that channel ID, I can say if it doesn't, if our channel ID does not includes the word replay, we're going to show this input. But now we can see that our input is here so that if we start the video and start to test, we can add the messages. But as soon as we click replay, we can see that the video is going to replay. We got our messages, but we don't have an input that is not necessary to type during that replay. The cool thing is there's a lot of ways for us to customize this experience, whether we're doing this live stream replay or if we want to do something else like create a Slack clone or really whatever you have in mind. The Stream API and SDK gives us a lot of flexibility for how we can build the experience we want with a lot of drop-in components and tools to make that easy. What's your favorite use case for building a live chat experience around it? Is it something like watching a replay together with people, or is it something else? Let me know in the comments. Now, once you have all those replays, you probably want to show them in a grid so people can find the replay they want, and they probably need thumbnails. So you can check out my video, Generate Video Thumbnails on the Fly, where you can grab it from the video itself automatically and add preview effects with Cloudinary. Or if you want to learn how to build more custom interactions inside of your application, check out my video detecting long press gestures with JavaScript events in React that we also walk through custom React hooks. Thanks Stream for sponsoring this video, and if you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.